Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. Apologies if my voice is a little bit rough at the moment and if my nose is still a little bit red. I am recovering from the flu. But anyway, that's not why you're here. You're here because I guess you're as morbidly curious as I am about Christians on the internet thinking that they're like saying something really intelligent, saying something really like, you know, gotcha moment, sort of like owning people. But actually, if you know anything about the subject that they're talking about, half the time they're just displaying their ignorance rather than showing that they like are smarter than anyone else. And of course, this is not unique to Christians. This is found in literally every group of people because it is a very common human trait. And we see it a lot on the internet. So today I'm going to talk about something that is actually in my wheelhouse, which is psychological research. In the last couple of months, I finished my thesis, which was written on psychometric testing. I used psychometric testing for my research project, and that means that I had to understand the limitations of it in order to talk about it as an academic. Academics don't just say, oh, I made up this questionnaire and it's completely infallible and perfect and it can show you causation and all this other stuff. That never happens. If someone is saying something like that, that person is not an academic. If someone makes claims like that, that person does not understand how science works. They don't understand the limitations of certain types of testing and measurements. And this is an example of that. So I was on Twitter or X the other day and I came across a post because I follow David Wood, who apparently now goes by Dr. David Wood, and I don't know what sort of doctorate he's got, but apparently he hasn't done research. But anyway, I'm not like antagonistic towards this person at all. I've actually watched his content quite happily. I think that he has contributed to Christian apologetics in the past. He does openly talk about the fact that he is a diagnosed sociopath and has antisocial personality disorder. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't change or that he can't be redeemed in some way. It just means that he has certain tendencies of behavior and cognition which make him very antagonistic towards others. And if he's not regularly sort of checking that behavior, then it could bleed out into his ministry and into his work, which is, I think, what we're seeing in this particular example. So the post says, ouch, why is there such a strong correlation between the name Muhammad and low IQ? Coincidence? By the way, he links the source. So this is apparently a Danish army IQ test group of results, and we will have a look at the actual graph a bit closer. Now, if you're not particularly familiar with Denmark as a country, it is a place which is pretty much genetically unchanged for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in more recent decades, they've had a large influx of refugee and migrant populations from the Middle East. How do I know much about Denmark? Because my ex-husband was Danish. Probably still is Danish, actually. But yes, I was married to a Dane, and he lived and worked in Denmark for a number of years, and he worked with these particular migrants, and he didn't really have anything bad particularly to say about them. He did say that their attitude towards women was pretty terrible, which is saying something coming from him. But if that's the harshest criticism that someone has, then the same criticism can easily be made of many Christian sects, which also have terrible attitudes towards women. My ex used to say that the migrant population were very hardworking, very competent at what they did, and much less entitled than the local Danish population. So that's a first-hand account that I've had from a Danish person about migrant populations in Denmark. But let's have a look at the graph. So the graph has a huge cluster of names in the sort of top right corner of the graph. And then in the bottom left corner, it has a few names dotted here and there, which are distinctly Middle Eastern. So the names in the top right corner are distinctly, or at least majority of them are very Scandinavian names, including male and female names. You can see that the statistical test that they've used is a general linear model, and you can tell that because of the line of best fit that goes through all the different data points from lowest to highest. This is a correlational statistical test, and it cannot tell you anything about causation. It can only tell you that there is a correlation. However, there isn't just one axis. There are two axes. So the bottom axis is the only one that David Wood apparently paid any attention to, which is the average IQ of Danish military test. And then the other axis, which I paid attention to because as a scientist you're supposed to do that, is socioeconomic factors. So how can we interpret this data? Well, we can look at other explanatory factors, which is what scientists do. They control for other confounding variables in their work. There are huge discrepancies between socioeconomic status. So the people who tested at the lower end of IQ also were at the very lowest end of socioeconomic status. And the people who tested higher generally had higher socioeconomic status. In fact, that's actually what the line of best fit shows us. It shows us that there is a correlation not between names, but between socioeconomic status. The fact that the name groups tend to be segmented by ethnicity is probably indicative of their educational and economic background. There are discrepancies between the local Danish population in terms of the education that they've had and the economic power that they have, and the migrant population who perhaps were unable to complete their education in their home country and possibly haven't had opportunities in their new country. Now, if you're wondering who goes into the Danish military, well, that's everyone. So, well, not everyone, but it could be anyone. So in Denmark, they have a conscription system. It's kind of similar to Israel in that if you're a citizen of their country, you can be called into military service. And you don't necessarily have a choice. You can get out of it if you have like some extenuating circumstances. But generally speaking, if you are conscripted, you have to serve. So there's a very high chance that a lot of the people from the local Danish population who were conscripted into the military also have university educations. Now you might be wondering, what exactly does this have to do with IQ? Because theoretically the test is measuring IQ, it's not measuring education level, right? Except that IQ tests actually are measuring education. Okay, let's do a quick crash course in psychometric testing. So when a psychologist or a psychiatrist or someone in the social sciences is trying to do research, they have these what we call constructs, which is sort of like the idea of something. So intelligence in this instance. You have the construct of intelligence, and you can kind of explain what intelligence is, but you can't necessarily measure it. That's one of the issues with the social sciences. It's not a hard science, so you can't get out a literal measuring tape and measure someone's intelligence. That's not physically possible. So how do social scientists measure something that is not physical and cannot be measured? And when it comes to research, what the researchers have to do is they have to operationalize the construct. What that means is they have to take the construct and the definition that they've given to the construct, and then they have to figure out how to measure it. So they turn it into things that can be measured, sort of like the rating system. For example, depression. You would use something like a Likert test, where you rate something from 1 to 4, and you say, how often do you feel this way? And the person would rate it, and then the scientist has to figure out like cut-off scores of like, what is the threshold between normal and pathological. So it's tricky. When it comes to IQ tests, there will be a number of items in the test which are straight questions with answers that you can give, and that's probably the most likely to measure education. But to try and figure out a way around that, people who develop these tests also use things like patterns that you put together from a picture with the use of blocks and things like that, memory tests, and speed tests for like pattern recognition and that sort of thing. Further research has found that these sort of non-educational tests actually are kind of still based on education. To explain it another way, we could use the analogy of trying to measure height by measuring weight. So let's say you have a population of people and you only have one form of measurement, which is a set of bathroom scales. And you don't have a tape measure that can measure someone's height. So all you can do is weigh people and then assume their height from their weight, based on the theory that, you know, if someone is heavier, chances are they're taller. However, that assumption only works if everyone has a roughly similar physical build. So if everyone's got the same ratio of muscle to fat, and assuming that people aren't overweight or underweight. Chances are, if you are weighing someone, then their height is a factor in how much they weigh. However, their diet and their exercise routine also plays a role. If you have someone from an underprivileged background, chances are they will be skinnier than the average population because they're not getting the same nutrition. And if you have someone who is from a wealthy population, they might be accumulating more weight. At this point, you might be wondering why people even use IQ tests anymore, and that is a good question. And I can tell you that their use has gone down significantly over the years since they realized that it's not as effective at measuring the construct that they thought it was measuring, and it's pretty much faded out of use except in corporate settings. So IQ tests, when they first were developed and everyone was like, oh great, we can measure intelligence, they actually used them a lot in schooling to try and diagnose disabilities so that they could provide, support that was necessary for particular students. And it kind of reminds me of like Forrest Gump, if you've seen that movie. Chances are you have seen that movie. But he was assessed for intelligence when he was a small child just starting school, and they rated him as not very intelligent. I think from memory he had like a score of 60 or something. And they classed him as essentially needing like special ed. But his mum managed to negotiate a different arrangement for him, and he was kept in regular schooling. And similar to the movie version, they figured out over the years that these tests don't really show what the true aptitude of different students actually is. And they might not have the aptitude for the test, but they can have an aptitude for things that they're interested in. Social researchers always understand and keep in the back of their mind that there are a number of different factors that play a role in the results that we get from different data. For something like an intelligence test, you've got education levels, you've got language barriers. So in the example of the Danish military, was the test administered in Danish? Was it administered in English? We don't know. I think it's probably safe to say that the test was not administered in the first language of the people who scored the lowest. So there are language barriers that need to be taken into consideration. Then there are other things going on. For example, if someone is from a low socioeconomic background, chances are they're not getting a very good diet, they're perhaps not getting the best sleep, and that can impact their performance on tests. An individual's current health status can impact their ability to perform in tests. And psychological factors such as PTSD can also impact someone's ability to perform in tests. Myself, for example, I had PTSD as a teenager, and it seriously impacted my schooling so that my grades gradually plummeted over the last few years of high school. And I went from an A-B student in my younger years of high school to a C average in my last year of high school. But years later, since recovering from that, I've managed to complete my university degree in psychology and my honors in psychology, and I have maintained a distinction average for those core subjects. So my performance as a teenager was not indicative of my actual intelligence. And when I have done an intelligence test, it has said that I have an IQ of about 115. So I'm not stupid, but I didn't do well when I had a trauma brain, because it literally changes your brain functionality during that time period. And that's why no one ever has a causal claim when it comes to correlational data. A real scientist and someone who understands how research works never makes that claim. They never say, oh, well, this proves that this group of people are dumb. The whole idea of like setting yourself up as an apologist or an evangelist to specific groups of people, because David Wood's target demographic that he creates content for, which is why I haven't really seen that much of his content, is because I'm not in the target demographic. But his target demographic is supposedly Muslims and atheists. Those are the people that he sort of, I guess, debunks in some way. And I'm wondering how exactly he proposes to preach the gospel to these people. If his whole attitude is they're too stupid to be Christian, then how is he actually offering them redemption in any way? How is this good news to them? How is this showing the love of Christ to a group of people? If they're not even smart enough to actually be Christian in the first place, then you're essentially locking them out of the kingdom. This is not evangelism at its finest. This is just sitting in an echo chamber, mocking a group of people that you don't agree with. So I thought I should probably quote some sources so that you're not just taking my word for it, because you don't know me from a bar of soap. So the Polytechnique from France has an article which says, IQ, can intelligence really be measured? This is by Jacques Gregoire, who is a professor at the Faculty of Psychology in the University of Louvain. So he writes, the purpose of the intelligence quotient, or IQ, is to estimate a person's intelligence using a tool made up of a series of questions, the IQ test. Taken in conjunction with a psychologist, the test produces a score which can be compared with the average for the population in question, set at 100. So 100 is the average score. But in order to get the average score, they have to have a sample population who they test first, and then they norm it. So they norm the data, and they say that the majority must be somewhere in the middle, and so that becomes the middle. But to what extent can IQ tests be used to assess intelligence? So here we have some debunking that Jacques is going to do. So the first myth is that IQ is an absolute measure of intelligence, which is false. The IQ is sometimes considered to be an objective measure of intelligence, but this is not the case. Intelligence is a quality that cannot be seen, so how can it be measured? From the beginning of the 20th century onwards, researchers refined their knowledge of the structure of intelligence. This has led to the development of major sets of tests to assess various facets: verbal, visual spatial, working memory, etc. Current tests estimate an individual's intellectual level based on the results obtained in the various exercises. But it should be noted that this is only an estimate. Firstly, the score is a relative measure. It defines where the individual stands in relation to the average of the group to which they belong, which is set at 100. What's more, any measure, in psychology as in any other field, is subject to error. This is why IQ should always be given with a confidence interval, for example, of plus or minus 5 points. What's more, an IQ test is subject to many uncertainties: the conditions under which the test was conducted, the objective sought, the deliberate or inadvertent errors made, etc. As a result, it is imperative that the result obtained be accompanied by an analysis by a trained practitioner. Without interpretation, an IQ score means nothing. The next point is a low IQ indicates a mental handicap, which is currently inconclusive. IQ is constructed in such a way that within an interval of plus or minus 1 standard deviation around the mean, from 85 to 115, we find 68% of the population. Consequently, having a score below 100 is certainly not a sign of intellectual disability. You are literally still in the average zone at that point. So if your score is like 85 to 100, that's still average. In the same way that my score of like 115 is still technically average. There is, however, a standard whereby a score of 2 standard deviations below the mean, less than 70, is considered to be a sign of mental disability, but this score alone is not enough to make a diagnosis. It must always be accompanied by other tests or examinations to provide a more detailed analysis, especially as the results of an IQ test can be influenced by many factors. For example, fatigue, drug use, or a psychiatric condition can affect an individual's performance. This means that IQ tests are not always reliable. If we go back to the original graph here and have a quick look, you can see the average score of 100 is the mean average, and then we've got 1 standard deviation, which is the score of 85, and the average Danish population is very average. Like, the majority of people in the cluster of high socioeconomic privilege are below the average of 100. So if we compare that with the other demographic of Middle Eastern names, then there's actually not that much of a substantial difference between their scores. It's kind of blown more out of proportion because of the way that the graph is displayed. Like, it doesn't even finish at the end of one standard deviation on the right-hand side of the graph. You can't even see my score, which is 115. This is a somewhat dishonest way to visually represent data because it doesn't actually show you what the standard deviation should be if the Danish population was actually smart. But instead, we have a population which is extremely average, and that's fine. It's nothing wrong with being extremely average, but it's misleading to compare. So the next point is why I'm very dubious about why this test was done and who it was actually done by. So the next point is everyone needs to know what their IQ is, which is false. An IQ test is first and foremost a clinical tool used to meet a specific objective, to diagnose mental disability, to assess the cerebral consequences of a cranial trauma, to detect a deterioration in cognitive faculties due to aging, and so on. The question must therefore be of a general nature. What is the problem to be solved? The IQ test may or may not help to achieve this goal, but it is not an end in itself. Some people want to consult a professional to find out their IQ, often in the hope of obtaining an exceptionally high score. But what's the point? Even in a professional or educational environment, IQ is not enough to predict performance. Other indicators may be more relevant, such as results in examinations, competitions, or technical tests. The IQ test should not be used as an absolute reference to classify individuals. That is not its purpose. Yes, even originally when IQ tests were more common in schooling, it was for the purposes of screening for mental disability, so that students could be assisted in some way. The more recent development of IQ tests becoming popular in corporate settings so that bosses can decide who to promote and that sort of thing is not what the test is supposed to be used for. And it actually doesn't indicate who's going to be a successful worker. Okay, so the next point is IQ depends on social and family environment. True. Intelligence, while partly innate, can only develop in a favorable context. School, family, and social environment all play a fundamental role. As a result, IQ cannot be measured without reference to education or the social and family context, because intelligence is linked to these. This may seem unfair, but it is a reality that can be seen in other areas. The child of two top sportsmen and women will more easily develop athletic skills, and the same is true of the children of professional musicians. So how can we know that IQ testing tends to measure things like educational background and family background? Or the American Psychological Association has this article. Intelligence and achievement testing. Is the half-full glass getting fuller? When psychologist Alfred Binet developed a test to measure the intellectual skills of French schoolchildren in 1904, he could not have possibly imagined how his research would change the world. In the last century, IQ and achievement tests have changed the face of education and employment all over the industrialized world. Given modern controversies regarding IQ testing, one might ask how Binet viewed intelligence. Binet equated intelligence with common sense. He called intelligence judgment, good sense, the faculty of adapting oneself to circumstances. Binet also believed that intelligence is a combination of many skills that are shaped heavily by the environment. His research goal was to help teachers adapt their teaching methods to the needs and abilities of individual students. Students with a weakness in maths, for example, could receive special attention in this specific area. Things changed when IQ and achievement tests were transplanted to America. Some researchers continued to believe that intelligence is a learned combination of many different skills and abilities. Others, however, assumed that intelligence is a single trait that is heavily determined by genetics. Some people further assumed that there are large ethnic or racial differences in general intelligence. A new wave of research now supports Binet's original, more progressive assumptions. For example, researchers have shown that IQs have been steadily rising year by year all over the industrialized world. This historical tendency for average IQ to increase is called the Flynn effect, named after James R. Flynn. The Flynn effect has profound implications for how one thinks about IQ. For example, the Flynn effect means that blacks today have a higher average IQ performance than whites of 60 or 70 years ago. This difference cannot be genetic because human gene pools do not change over such short periods. So the APA, the governing body for psychology in the US, has literally said that the whole myth of ethnic intelligence has been debunked by the actual testing itself, and the exposure to education over the years in different communities has shown that when people have access to better nutrition, better schooling, and things like that, they perform better. But let's hear from schools themselves. So this is the AASA, the School Superintendents Association, and their article titled Alternative Measures of Intelligence: 5 Reasons Why IQ Tests Have No Value in Kinder to 12 Schooling and Never Did. Today, no reason exists to subject elementary school pupils to IQ tests. All the reasons that once seemed so important have since proved to be invalid. Here are the 5 main reasons they were given, why they are not valid for any of those reasons, and some alternative measures. Number 1, to identify a student's native ability, what the student is capable of, independent of upbringing, as well as social and cultural opportunities. This was a noble goal and remains one. Unfortunately, research has proven it to be an impossible goal to reach with current technology, because IQ tests measure achievement, for example, vocabulary, arithmetic, general information, and puzzle solving. They automatically also measure past social and cultural opportunities. It once was thought that certain tests, those with geometric symbols like squares and circles, would bypass such opportunities, but research has shown the opposite. The abstract geometric tests that once were thought to be independent of Western schooling are more dependent on Western schooling than are the verbal tests. In addition, there was a hope that tests of reaction time, that is the time required to respond as quickly as possible to relatively simple stimuli, would be a good intelligence measure. But they are not. Nor are there any existing direct measures of brain functioning. Maybe some future day. No existing IQ or other tests can separate past opportunities from test performance. One other thing. Did you know that during the 20th century, IQs around the world rose on average 3 points every 10 years, for a grand total of 30 points over just 1 century? Researcher James Flynn at the University of Otago in New Zealand discovered that, with respect to IQ, the gifted students of the year 1900 would have been just average in IQ in 2000. The average student in 1900 would have been at the border of showing serious intellectual challenges. The only reason the average IQ remained at 100 is that test publishers kept renorming the test populations, setting new expectations for what constituted a score at a certain level. So if you thought IQ measures native ability, forget about it. Flynn's data show that better schooling, nutrition, medical care, technology, and other factors all contribute to IQ. The second reason was to predict school achievement. IQ tests predict school achievement because they are achievement tests for the knowledge and skills students were supposed to have mastered a few years before. Alfred Binet in France purposely constructed the first test to predict school achievement and correctly figured that the best predictor of future achievement would be past achievement. If a student whose achievement has been high starts doing poorly, don't look for explanations about ability. Ask what happened to their motivation or personal life. If a student who has been a low achiever starts becoming a high achiever, chances are there is an excellent teacher somewhere in the mix who has found a way to motivate the student. That's the other thing. There's this assumption that IQ is somehow static. Chances are if I took another IQ test now, like 20 years after my only IQ test, I would have a completely different score, because those tests, they do things like speed tests, and your speed as you get older goes down. Your response times get slower as you age, which is one of the reasons why they sort of redo like driving tests as you get older. But on the flip side, your knowledge increases. So people's IQ score tends to change as they get more knowledge. And that's why they're not really reliable measures of intelligence. So as I said before, IQ tests, they're the only measurement that we currently have for, I guess, intellectual capability. But it's an imperfect measuring system because it doesn't necessarily measure the construct that it's attempting to measure. It's literally like trying to use weight scales to figure out someone's height. You can get an approximate, but it's not really going to give you an accurate score. And that's why it's kind of laughable that David Wood was out there on X going, ha ha, Muslims are stupid. And he kind of showed his own stupidity in that, because he didn't actually understand what these tests are or how to interpret the results or how to read the data. So he kind of made himself look like a fool. And that's why Christians shouldn't set out to insult a group of people who are, potentially antagonistic toward, actually quite antagonistic towards them. It doesn't make us look good. It doesn't actually make us look intelligent either. One of the reasons why God recommends that we be humble is because we don't know what we don't know. And that kind of goes back to the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you've ever looked that one up, that's some hilarious research. The researchers Dunning and Kruger found that humans have this tendency to overestimate their own intelligence and competence when they actually don't know very much. They're more likely to think that they're an expert when they're a complete novice than they are when they're actually an expert. So actual experts are like, yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't know, and that's okay because I can look it up or I can learn more about it. Whereas someone who knows very little is like, I'm amazing, listen to me, I can tell you everything. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect in a nutshell. And it was sort of on display on X. And there's no reason for Christians to be like that. We don't have anything to really prove. Or we shouldn't. We don't need to be condescending and arrogant towards our opponents, because we're already on the side of truth. We know what the truth is, and we can share that truth in a spirit of wanting people to be free, wanting people to find redemption, wanting people to experience the love and joy of Christ. It's completely unnecessary for Christians to be arrogant douchebags on social media. It doesn't represent Christ favorably. The commandment to not take the Lord's name in vain is being broken when people do that. because that commandment is not about swearing. I mean, I'm not saying that swearing using God is good, but the actual commandment is similar to like when a wife takes her husband's name and then goes about playing an absolute fool using his name. How does that reflect upon her husband? So the same thing happens with the church. The church is married to Christ. We have taken his name as his bride. And if we go about representing our husband as this loud-mouthed, obnoxious harlot, then how does that reflect upon our husband? I don't see how this is ever going to win Muslims to Christ. If anything, it's just going to insult them. It's probably not even true. And it doesn't look well for Christians, for other people who are witnessing it. Like people who are not Christian or Muslim, if they see this sort of behavior, they're like, well, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be a douchebag. Can a sociopath change? Potentially. Sociopathy is treatable. Psychopathy is not. But, you know, you have to be willing. The participant has to be willing to humble themselves in order to benefit from the treatment, to benefit from the redemption. They have to let go of these defense mechanisms that they have built into their personality. And that's tricky. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about this whole situation? Give this video a like if you liked it, share it with other people, and subscribe to the channel if you want more. And I will see you next time. Take care, God bless.